meine Damen und Herren. Ich darf Sie ganz herzlich begrüßen zu unserer heutigen Veranstaltung. Mein Name ist Ulrich Wilmes, Hauptkurator hier am Haus der Kunst. Und ich bin sehr stolz und froh, Ihnen heute Abend zwei der renommiertesten Wissenschaftlerinnen auf dem Gebiet feministischer Theorie, feministischer Kunstgeschichte, überhaupt zeitgenössischer Kunstgeschichte vorstellen zu dürfen. And my very warm and very special welcome goes to Griselda Pollock and Angela Dimitrakaki. Welcome, please, and please help me to welcome our very dear guests. So, I'm in the lucky position to, ich mache noch ein paar Worte auf Deutsch. Sorry, a few words in German. Ich bin in der glücklichen Position, heute die Begrüßung machen zu dürfen und dann aber den Abend genau wie Sie genießen zu können. Ich möchte noch meine Kollegin Lara Demori vorstellen, die Konversation, die Diskussion von Angela und Griselda heute Abend moderieren wird und sie wird uns auch gleich beide Sprecherinnen noch im Detail vorstellen. Ich darf jetzt das Wort abgeben an Lara Demori und wünsche Ihnen allen einen hochspannenden, interessanten Abend. Vielen Dank.
It's good. Can I have my image? Thanks. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the theme, and then I'm going to leave the place to our speaker. So in 1971, Ninda Nochlin published the groundbreaking essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" which is, of course, a provocation. And I thought about showing this image because it's quite funny how the title of this essay has been appropriated by Dior and who decided to make T-shirts. So how spread has been and appropriated by fashion culture as well. In this paper, Nochlin asked and analyzed how gender influenced the production and reception of art, investigating the predominance of white male artists in the Western art world and the status of women artists who have been historically prevented from gaining an equal education and developing their talent. Both Nochlin and Griselda Pollock, in different ways, have further questioned the label of genius as constantly been associated with white male artists, unfolding the privileges inherent to the use of this terminology. In mid-80s, scholars like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks addressed the absence of women of color in feminist art discourses, calling for the importance of intersectionality in such discussions. Likewise, Chandra Talpate Mohanty, Gayatri Spigva, and Gloria Anzaldúa, among others, advocated for a more comprehensive feminist analysis, capable of taking into account women from post-colonial countries, facing both imperial and patriarchal ideologies. They went against the homogenizing tendency advanced, they claimed, by second-wave feminism, and we're going to discuss about these things of the waves later in our panel discussion, that understood women as a homogeneous group on the basis of gender and a shared oppressed condition, which they describe as a universal sisterhood. As Mi Kwon Kwon remarks, some female artists from the 60s and the 70s have been grouped together and associated with, and I'm quoting her here, a belief in female sexuality as an innate quality, produced at a time when women's demand for autonomous and self-defined sexuality became a metaphor for the struggle for personal liberation, end quote. Some feminist scholars have criticized this stance as essentialist due to the categories of feminine and woman being presented as highly historical, with characteristics belonging naturally and universally to one gender, upholding rather than challenging the patriarchal hierarchies of sexual difference, which is in fact engendered by specific sociocultural conventions and ideologies. The current state of feminist criticism and feminist art criticism as well, appears to be crossed by different narratives, to the point that Griselda Pollock describes the relationship between third-wave feminism and second-wave feminism as that of the mother and the envious daughter, understood in Oedipal terms. She also denounces the obsession of the coming after that results in the tendency of declaring, quote, feminism is dead, or the suppression of feminism by post-feminists, or the drawing of the second wave in the third or fourth waves, and so forth, before a full understanding of the importance that feminism has had in so far. Pollock has therefore observed, quote, to create transnational democratic space for the continuing virtuality of feminism, we need historical understanding of feminism itself that is different from the currently fracturing caricature of generation at war and waves of novelty, end quote. On this matter, recent literature, and here I'm referring to an issue of Third Text that came out in 2017, edited by Angela Dimitrakaki and Kristen Lloyd, exploring approaches to social reproduction in art history, has challenged the presence of multiple and parallel feminism. If such parallel feminisms are used to force some sort of compromise, some sort of accommodation of the diversity of positions in order to forge inclusivity. Between 1972 and 1977, feminist art critic Carla Lonzi saw art as the highest state of consciousness reached by male culture. She claimed that to identify as an artist, art critic in her respect, was an equivalent to an unforgivable compromise with patriarchy. She consequently withdrew from her position of art critic to pursue her feminist activism. But are the two positions of art critic and feminist truly incompatible? Beginning with this premise, the set of talks this evening aims to encourage a dialogue between different generations of feminist art historians by discussing contemporary approaches to feminist art theory, its relation to the history of feminism, and the valued importance that feminist art theory holds today. And on that note, I would like to introduce our first speakers for today. She doesn't really need introductions, but Griselda Pollock is Professor of Social and Critical Histories, art director of the Center of Cultural Analysis, Theory and History at the University of Leeds. Committed to creating and extending an international post-colonial queer feminist analysis of the visual arts, visual culture, and cultural theory, her work focuses on trauma and aesthetic transformation by developing Avi Warburg's concept of the pathos formula for the study of art and for curatorial work and art writing after the event. And she has done a few publications on this. Since the 2011, she has published extensively on the political aesthetics of concentrationary memory, developed in relation to Hannah Arendt post-war analysis of the totalitarian as the political assault on democracy and the human condition, creating the necessity for a vigilant political memory. This research is published in several books: Concentrationary Cinema, 2011, Concentrationary Memories, Totalitarian Terror and Cultural Resistance, and Concentrationary Imaginaries, Tracing Totalitarian Violence in Popular Culture. She's currently analyzing the bad, in terms of politically destructive, cultural memory of feminism, with specific reference to feminist intervention in art and art history. And this is going to be one of her forthcoming book called Feminism, Is Feminism a Bad Memory?, which is going to publish in 2018, by the end of this year. And also she's writing a feminist Warburgian reading of the agency and image making of Marilyn Monroe and the intersection of cinema, photography, visual art, and cultural memory. Just published is a major monograph on the monumental painting cycle Leben, Oder Theater, by Charlotte Salomon, titled Charlotte Salomon in the Theater of Memory, that just came out with Yale University Press in 2018. And she's completing a long-term project called The Case Against Van Gogh, Place Memory and the Retreat for the Mother, who is going to come out in 2019. Her talk today is titled Action, Activism and as Thought, a dialogue where the artworking of Sonia Khurana and Sutapa Biswas via the political theory of Hannah Arendt. And please join me, welcome Griselda Pollock.
little person. Thank you so much. Es freut mich sehr, hier zu sein. But I will not speak in German. I was planning to, but I have been asked to speak in English. So I have translated most of the quotations I'm going to use in the hope that that will facilitate everybody's understanding. Okay, I need my button. Okay. Now, what have I been doing for the last 40 years? I would explain my project as a feminist art historian as the attempt to develop concepts adequate to the challenges we face in trying to think about the role of art and the role of art history in the production of certain social relations of gender as well as class, race, and sexuality. And so I put up my books not to advertise them, so please do buy them, that would be great. But it is there to see that the titles are not the names of individuals, they're not themes, they are concepts, whether it is language, whether it's about vision, whether it's about the color and gender of art history, avant-garde gambits, generations and geographies as a way of thinking the problematic of the post-colonial, the issue of differencing the canon, and the most recent concept that I'm working with is the virtual feminist museum. So we need to think about this concept, but we need to think about why do we need concepts. I'm sorry, that doesn't seem to be right. Sorry, something has disappeared. Okay, we need concepts in order to think our way in the world that we do not control. And concepts are not a means of control, but a form of address that carve out for us a space and a time in which we may become capable of responding to the indeterminate particularity of events. This is a quotation from the Australian philosopher Elizabeth Gross. She continues, concepts are a way of addressing the future, and in this sense are the conditions under which a future different from the present, which is the very goal of every radical politics, becomes possible. Concepts are not premonitions, ways of predicting what will be. On the contrary, they are the ways we enact new forces. They are themselves the making of the new. In this sense, she then says theory is virtual. I quote, in short, theory is never about us, about who we are. It affirms only what we can become, extracted as it is from the events that move us beyond ourselves. Feminist theory is essential, not as a plan or as an anticipation of action to come, but as the addition of the capacity to imagine, to go beyond the material reality of the horrifying present that we experience as patriarchal, racist, ethnocentric. It becomes the ballast to enable the present to be transformed. Oh, sorry. This is not, wait a sec, we need to be back one. We played around with different PowerPoints, and so I'm sorry, this is a little mixed here. Now, the Virtual Feminist Museum is not a cybernetic museum. It's not online. Its virtuality is philosophical. That's to say, virtuality is the attribute of feminism as a project which is still to come. Far from being over and in the past, that we assess it, we have not yet got it. It is a project for a future still to be created, and the capacity of feminism to transform us and our world is as yet unrealized. Even after 200 years of effective political struggle, you must remember that the women's movement is one of the most successful social movements of the 20th century, but also after another half century of radical intellectual work, the other great event of the 20th century is feminist thinking, that it is women thinking about the problematic of gender in their own name. The Virtual Feminist Museum also allows me to assemble installations that no museum would commission or permit, and I have tried. The reason for that is it follows logics of association and connection that are distinct from and deeply opposed to the logics of association and connection which are permitted by canonized art history and are still apparent in contemporary art installations, art exhibitions and art curation, that is to say the cult of the individual artist or the group show and thematic representations, which is another way of talking about iconography. My installation for today concerns the ethics and politics of the body as a speaking to this exhibitions in this museum, and it is focused on one pathos formel in Warburg's terms, which is lying down. The image on the screen is a photographic work related to a long-term performance project by the Delhi-based artist Sonia Khurana, born 1968, called Lying Down. It is one of the earliest instances in a work which is called The Logic of Birds, in which she lay down in one of the public places in Barcelona in 2006. Sonia Khurana tells us about this work. In the beginning, she says, Logic of Birds was a direct consequence of a recent spate of incidents in my life, leading amongst other things to a sense of profound loss. This got translated into a question about the psychological implications of loss. The impulse to lie on the ground, to feel the cold asphalt, recurred several times and for different reasons. I was then in many cities and other things flowed into my consciousness. I was filming, I was making images, and I felt this deep desire to lie down in the Place de la Bastille and then later in other places. And I suppose this was a way of playing out a certain state of dereliction inherent within us. So borrowing from Warburg's concept of the pathos formel, I interpret the logic of birds as a formulation for a state of contemporary psychological but also political dereliction. Because Warburg theorized the way the body can become a signifying gesture by doing something in action that is loaded with feeling, with affect, but then when it becomes encoded or iconized as an image, it transmits a memory trace of a once experienced intensity. So is Khurana's lying down the pathos formula not only of psychological but of political abjection? And any interpretation of her work, so if we can play this, you will see this as I speak through this. This is her film of the Barcelona event. But any interpretation would be sensitive to the changing contexts of lying down in public space. Khurana's outsiderness, her foreignness in terms of her Indian nationality when she performs as a brown body on the ground in a European city, is different from when she would lie down in India, where her class and her religion, or lack of appropriate religion, became significant and even, in fact, the source of violence and hostility. As this goes on, she releases seeds from her hands, which attract the pigeons who will eventually come and cover her, but time does not allow me to show you more of this. She then, in a second part of her work, just used the cutout of the prone body, which she then laid in different places and photographed. And one such instance in Hyderabad, a mob violence which forced her to remove it, reminding us how different the image, contemporary art image, functions in very specific ways. The police were called and she was forced to remove it because it was too close to a mosque and there should be no image. So Khurana's work registers an unnamed personal loss, but extending it to signify a shared condition. Lying down speaks of the weight of the trauma of psychological dereliction in the pathos of that act of giving way, wanting the support of the bare earth or the hard ground, giving into a wish to escape into unconsciousness or even sleep that might feel like death. This takes us to the level of the abject, not as the psychological condition. The abject is not that I'm disgusting, but that I am losing my boundaries and losing the contours of my subjectivity. And this is what she writes about the abject. I would like to talk about some of my concerns of performing the abject, especially the power and the lure of the abject. I'm immensely concerned with the power, the corporeal understanding of the body, and I find that corporeal significations are better resolved through performance. Through performance, I can engage with the constant struggle between body and language to achieve a corporeal eloquence, and that's the concept I want to bring up. She also talks about the notion of discovering the bodily at the sidelines of the social. So the significance of the abject is that it is the position from which we cannot sustain any intersubjectivity. Our subjectivity is losing its contours, therefore we cannot engage in an ethical or political relation to the other. And intersubjectivity is the condition of the political. So I want to move on quite quickly through this, because her work then calls to mind the new work of Judith Butler, who has talked about the notion of vulnerability as the condition of our political actions at the present. In a particular configuration of powers, we no longer seem to have the force of mass public movements, but when we do protest, as in Occupy and other situations that she is speaking of, we put our bodies into space in a condition of vulnerability, which is the power we have to exercise resistance, even if it meets, as Khurana did, violence. But let me just, so we've got to go back one. In the middle here of the vulnerabilities resistance, I want to remind you that Butler's work derives from an artist, Brache Ettinger, on whom she was writing in 2011, when Ettinger published a very important essay called Fragilization and Resistance. And I can't go into that because time is running away with me, but it is an important loop. We think theory gets applied to art, but art actually generates reflections as it translates itself from making into writing and thinking that then becomes resources for our theory. And thus we get to Khurana's notion of the ethics and politics of being, when she says, when lying down, I've been asking myself, can the critical possibilities offered by small acts of transgression be considered beyond their value as individual acts for the potential of their accumulation? And can the dynamic build-up of infinitely small disturbances change structure into movement, a thing into a current? Now, I'm going to miss out the next bit, but because in my installation, I like to collect a number of different instances, and the artist you're showing here is Sutapa Biswas, who is 10 years older than Sonia Khurana, comes from Shantikhetan in West Bengal, but grew up in Britain, but increasingly uses the question of her own Indian body in the context of discovering a relationship back to India, and in relation to a different kind of configuration of the body. She made a series called Synapse from the classical Hindu sculpture, where she transgressively lays her Indian female body. So one has to stress this, which is if you watch Bollywood, any Indian movies, there is no explicit nudity in contemporary Indian representation without it considered a transgression. So this is moving between the two cultures, the use again of the body to represent the grounded connection between past and present. Now, what I want to finish with quickly is the moving, as you can see, this is a whole history of the body that takes us through Anya Mendieta using the body as a way to reclaim the exile's lost home, a political gesture, or this is Laura Aguilar, a lesbian, a queer Mexican-Irish photographer who has recently died literally 4 or 5 days ago, quite tragically. And the way in which this conception of sleeping and lying would run through an installation to begin to explore the mythic dimensions that would return us to the idea of the passivity of women that's enshrined in fairy tales, as we have discussed by Ellen Siksu. And this would finally lead me back to Sonia Khurana's most recent work on sleep, but on mothers and daughters in sleep, the insomniac and the somnolent, in a beautiful series of works, which of course significantly she hangs vertically. Now, you're missing out on all sorts of wonderful things in her work, but we will just jump to how does this fit with what we're trying to discuss here, and the 2-3 points I want to make at the end. Lara mentioned that my work is about, at the moment, this concept of concentrationary memory. We have the memory of mourning for the violence of the 20th century, but we are not aware so much as we should be that what happened in the 20th century was the invention of a form of anti-politics that is specifically experimentally about the assault on the human condition. The human condition is not an essence or a nature, it is the political condition of the possibility of speech and action together. It's the condition of the possibility of political transformation. And in her work, Hannah Arendt made the question addressed that I were picking up, then looked at the history of something like Documenta, which resonates very much with this particular space, founded as it was in 1955 to reconnect German culture to a history that had been ruptured by the rise of totalitarianism, which involved the erasure of what we consider to be the significant gestures of modern art. And the question I'm asking in this other research project is there any space in art for it to be a critical space of public discourse on the political conditions of our human condition, or has it become so entirely corrupted by financialization, entertainment, tourism, and increasingly, since 2007, the site of where the bankers put their money now and store it in the free ports, as Hito Steil so brilliantly tells us. So Hannah Arendt, what I want you to pick up on here is the idea of what is it what we remember in feminism when we look at images of women coming together to act in public space, not to lie down, but to speak. And this famous image of Women of the World Unite, walking down in 1970 in New York, may set off all sorts of bad bells in your head about the notion of how could this be? Isn't this a naive notion that women of the world could unite, that we could summon women? But what we forget is until this point, even though there's a degree of this in the 19th century, but until this point, women as women do not enter the political stage, calling to each other in the terms that Marx said, workers of the world unite. This is to create, in a sense, a class consciousness of women. But at the very point you summon women onto the stage, you make visible the problematic that inheres within the fact that the condition of women is stratified, riven with violence of other kinds of oppression exercised by women against other women, forms of hegemonic imperialism, but that does not become visible before you create this speech act. So far from saying, oh, let's forget these women, they were indifferent, they didn't understand diversity, class, race, and gender, my argument is that this is the speech act that rather in terms, by bringing the unspoken onto the political stage, opens up that question of women to new antagonisms, which are then worked through as we work through the larger project of the transformation of this key dimension of human life, which is making gender the site of the conditions of living or dying, having or not having. And this plays through class, it plays through race. It is not like race, class, gender, sexuality. Feminism poses its questions to all of those. It challenges Marxism to think gender. It challenges the post-colonial to think gender and sexual difference. It challenges the post-colonial to think sexuality and queerness. This plays through a whole variety of complex ways, and in Rancièrean terms, from Jacques Rancière, it's at every point that we struggle for more democracy, new crises are produced productively, which we then work through. And rather than represent the past of history, the past of feminism as second wave, third wave, and a precious succession to some ever more up-to-date and fashionable concept, we have to understand the dynamic of the continuing virtuality of feminism that is worked through. And one final point I would make is that in this obviously historic image, we also have to remind ourselves that this is constantly happening, whether it's the Women's March against Trump in 2016 or in Delhi, the whole same issue of are women in Indian cities safe in a society in which women are raped and murdered in their thousands for being in public. That is still literally a life and death struggle, as it is, for instance, to be a lesbian in public in South Africa is a life and death issue with a lot of corrective rape and even murder. So we need to keep looking at these moments of the speech acts of collective, of coming together, and in these moments, the women here, this world belongs to women. Women is still, therefore, a political term, not a description, not an entity or an essence, but a summoning of a political force in culture. And I want to end quickly with one quotation from Hannah Arendt, which raises the question of if we are not going to produce this bad memory by sectioning feminism up into certain things and just telling what I would say is the American story as the only story and forgetting the many feminist initiatives everywhere in the world that constitute a much more complex and interwoven things, how do we transmit it? And Hannah Arendt in 1968 argued that education is the point, and I just need to find the text to read it, the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token to save it from the ruin, which except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. And education is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands the chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing the common world. And under education, I place myself as a teacher and a researcher, but also now, in just exactly as we're here, in the museum, as a place in which we are incited by the work of art to consider certain questions, to create the public forum for discussion and transmission. And I see this not as a family story of fighting daughters and mothers or opposing teams, but a question of how do we ensure the virtuality of that revolutionary dream that is part of the feminist project, to remove from the world forms of violence that are specifically and intensely related to ways in which we understand the body and come to be a political body and a political subjectivity. And the project for feminism, as I see it theoretically, and the role of art in that, is the fostering of what I call a new political subjectivity. The forces we are ranged against require other things to penetrate and break, which would have to be much more massively ardent, but we are not in a moment of anything more than resistance, persistence, and the good memory that will enable us to make a future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Griselda Pollock, for this illuminated talk, and we're going to discuss about it later. First, I'm going to introduce our second speaker tonight. Angela Dimitrakaki is a writer and senior lecturer in contemporary art history and theory at the University of Edinburgh, where she co-directs the master program Modern and Contemporary Art and the Global Contemporary Research Group. Her books include Economy, Art Production and the Subject in the 21st Century, 2015, co-edited with Kristen Lloyd, and Gender, Artwork and the Global Imperative, 2013, Politics in a Glass Case, Feminism, Exhibition Cultures and Curatorial Transgressions, 2013, co-edited with Lara Perry, and Art and Globalization from the Postmodern Sign to the Biopolitical Arena, 2013. In 2016, she co-edited a special volume on social reproduction for historical materialism, research in critical Marxist theory, and in 2017, a special issue on social reproduction and art for third text, for which she is now co-editing a special issue on anti-fascist art theory, forthcoming in 2019. In 2017, also, she was the recipient of an Academy of Athens Award for her fiction writing, and her talk today is titled Feminism and the Critique of the Political Economy of Art. Please join me in welcome Angela.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, for the great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I don't speak German, so I have not translated quotes, and I will address you all in English. And it's, of course, a great pleasure to also be here with Griselda Pollock, who is, for me, not a, but the foundational voice in the discipline in which I work. So, understanding, I'm going to probably recognize that this work, which I'm not going to be talking about at all, is by Claire Fontaine, the one that says someone is getting rich, from 2012. I will only mention two artworks, and my images are actually coming from a broader context. And there are very few. Right, so understanding this invitation to a roundtable on feminism and art theory now as a call to reflect on how the practice of art theory or the practice of theory supports feminist politics overall in our conjuncture, I want to begin with two recent experiences. First, in June 2017, we had a major international conference in London at Birkbeck called Feminist Emergency, and which brought together, and I quote, academics, scholars, poets, professionals, policymakers, and feminist activists, end of quote. I was invited as an academic to a panel on sex work, and I wondered why I was not invited as a feminist art historian to a panel on art. So then I checked the actual announcement, and I realized that there was no art in the conference included at all, no art theory, okay, whatsoever. This was a huge international event. So I appealed to the organizers to include a last-minute session, insisting that art, by which, and I will use this term in this way, by which the term art for me means a complex field of practices and ideas rather than artworks as the outputs of artistic labor. So I told them that I think art also faces this feminist emergency. So we put together quite hastily with some feminist colleagues, I can give the names later if they're needed, and the session filled a very large room. Here's an image of it. And we had some short papers. We had prepared some short papers, but very quickly, the women and few men in attendance limited the session's focus to labor defined by precarity, right? So the lesson I got from this was, although feminists in art apparently share the chief concern of a social body oppressed and exploited in the organization of labor by full-blown neoliberalism, feminist art theory had appeared irrelevant to a feminist gathering addressing this issue as a major emergency. So this is a big issue for me. The second story I want to share with you is in the first months of 2017, I collaborated with Antonia Majaka, who's actually a curator based in Berlin, and Sanja Ivekovic on the production of a social document called Towards an International Anti-Fascist Feminist Front, which was to respond to this piece that you see in preparation, which was actually I kind of, it was called a Monument to Revolution, Sanja Ivekovic's work, and I chose to show an image with a cleaner, kind of like cleaning the work in preparation. So, and the person at the back, who is a man, is installing some speakers for these social documents that I'll just talk about to be in that space and interact with the artwork. So, this social document took the form of a collective multilingual sound file comprising short text by feminists from across the globe, artists, theorists, activists, as individuals or representing feminist platforms. Leaving aside the very diverse responses we received, often referring to the links between the needs of capital and the rise of supremacy discourses, I want to highlight an issue that this social document raised for its initiators, that is Antonia and me, for instance, and Sonia, in the knowledge that this social document was produced also in collaboration with the art institution, in this case, Documenta for. So this prompted us to discuss whether we should offer a fee to contributors to an activist project intended to have a life after and beyond the art institution. Because we felt that paying a fee, right, was like buying participation. So we were too aware of the debates over the free labor on which the art institution thrives and how this exacerbates precarity. The Documenta 14 was caught in the thick web of real-world politics, as perhaps you know already, the politics of debt and neocolonialism, defining the relationship of Greece and Germany, put further pressure on us. We opted to pay very little, as resources allowed, the contributors. So we opted to pay them for the 3-minute long text that they sent, and the offer was not turned down, which was very different to what had happened with other feminist activist projects that had been involved outside the art field, right? Where the participants contribute their time and energy and labor for free. So my lesson was that political interventions crossing through art, in its inextricable link to the institution, must be aware of the clash between recognition and distribution, or else politics and the economy, and how historically constituted artistic labor operates within this clash, okay, this conflict, both materially and as an analytical category. So this anecdotal material and the lessons I drew dictated the focus of this short paper on how feminism encounters the critique of the political economy of art today. According to our historian, who is based in the US, Nizam Shaked, this preoccupation is not new, but rather an element of earlier practices related to conceptualism. And she writes, interested in a critique of political economy, philosophy, psychoanalysis, semiotics, institutional analysis, anthropology, and a range of developing approaches, they, and she lists 12 artists, of whom 7 are women and indeed feminists, introduced a variety of strategies back then to reference political subject matter from broad interdisciplinary perspectives. Indeed, Shaked's just want to show the cover of your book, frankly, but there it is, okay. So her book-length study on conceptualism and the political referent in contemporary art articulates an intricate history of these developments, at the core of which we find the social movements of the 60s and 70s. Just a few days ago from today, the same historian, Shaked, published another text where she explains she had to resign from the editorial board of Extra Contemporary Art Quarterly, a progressive art journal in the US with a long list of contributors, including many feminists. Perhaps you know this journal. It's very well known. The reason for her resignation was that the publication board is scheduling, and I quote her, an event at an establishment boycotted by a long list of grassroots organizations in Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights is a textbook case study where we can observe, here you can see a demonstration outside the gallery, we can observe the conflict between artwork-based and real-world-based politics. Indeed, a case study forcing this binary between art world and real world, despite the fact that binaries are an anathema for feminist thought and emancipatory politics at large. The binary is already encapsulated in the title of a 2017, an article from 2017 that brought Boyle Heights to international attention, and the title was, of this article, Art Washing or Between Social Practice and Social Reproduction, where we read, creatives thus appear as the foot soldiers of displacement rather than as the allies of diversity as they prefer to imagine themselves. For individuals and institutions engaged in social practices, this realization can come as quite a shock. This shock stems not merely from the defensiveness that results from being called out, but also from a real cognitive dissonance between an economic analysis of effects of art washing and the stated intentions of such groups towards inclusivity, multiculturalism, and even radicality. Likewise, Jacquet does not doubt the intentions of those caught in the Boyle Heights controversy, right? Where the interests of the class, gendered, racialized social body are undermined by how art, notably an art of an emancipatory purview, including so-called feminist art, which for me is a contested term, and I'm sure for Griselda as well, since he talked about interventions, but we'll carry on. So in this case, art by default operates in the wider network of practices controlled by capital as a social relation. But Jacquet does hit the nail in the head when she calls out reformism as effectively the dominant ideology of progressive politics in art at present, seeing the art field as the legitimizing discourse of liberalism. Liberalism for Jacquet, and for me, is a concept with a history, which we can read about here, and I've quote from her resignation, the public resignation statement. Liberalism, in its Keynesian capitalist version, held political belief in the power of reform. Since the election of Trump for office, reformists in the art world have recast themselves as the resistance. But they ignore a historical fact. Liberalism has been dead since Thatcher and Reagan killed it in 1979-80 and diverted liberalism to the free market doctrine of Friedrich Hayek. It is neoliberalism that has since reigned supreme. To be a liberal today is to take the side of economic neoliberalism, where deregulation, privatization, and financialization, which rely on globalization, militarization, and imperialism, stoked by and fueling racism, xenophobia, and nationalism, have in concert driven economic inequality to unprecedented extremes. I would like to see this not as a question of taking sides, kind of actively doing this, but rather finding yourself on the wrong political side, meaning waking up in the right side of the bed as far as capitalism hegemony is concerned. This, I believe, is a very urgent issue that feminist art theory must address. What materially operative mechanisms keep drawing art to the right, irrespective of the oppositional discourses and even practices that traverse it? Answering this question would require, of course, a rethinking of what I mentioned already, what feminist interventions, Griselda Pollock's phrase that has resonated with me since I first encountered it as a doctoral student, are, what these feminist interventions are and what they achieve, as well as a historically specific understanding of their limits and how these limits arise. So, in short, I suggest that feminist interventions need to be connected with a critique of the political economy of art at present, and this in turn requires a feminist art theory that can examine critically the historicity of its own development. How did feminist art theory change from the moment of its emergence in the 70s, when neoliberalism was effectively launched? So at that point, although it's got a much longer history as a concept, we have a kind of emergent project, right? We come all the way to, to our days, actually, when neoliberalism has become globally hegemonic and feminism must be articulated in an art field defined by its contradictions and widely lived outcomes. We really need to understand what happened between 1982, when Griselda Pollock published Vision, Voice, and Power, Feminist Art Histories and Marxism, where she asked, what is the relationship between women being seen as incapable of performing artistic labor and their naturalization as second-rate, low-paid workers? This question is posed in the text. And 2018, when Jacques Bidet, in an issue of Historical Materialism, published an article called Neoliberalism Facing Its Subjects. And there, he mentions 3 key characteristics: competition among teams in the groups of producers. That's the first. Second, self-organization demonstrating her productivity. He refers to a female worker, apparently. Her productivity and her employability linked to her profitability, second. And third characteristic, the abolition of wage earning. So these are the 3 things that kind of are very present today, shaping the neoliberal subject, if this thing is said to exist. Now, all these features of the neoliberal scape exist in art too, as much as in the academia, where we work as feminist art theorists, right? And it is no accident, of course, that Bidet uses a her and not a him, because it's a very feminized field. So there have been different analyses about how the mass entry of women in the economy is co-implicated with distinct features of neoliberalism and so-called post-Fordism. Yet all prevent a straightforward account of even a contextually defined feminist victory. So we really need to address this issue. We have no feminist study of how women's mass entry to art, the art field, impacted the actual existing art world since the 70s. My hope is that such a critical revisionism will help feminism differentiate between its actual theoretical dilemmas, and we have plenty of these, right, and the social circumstances that generate and possibly propagate such dilemmas. So I see this as a way of understanding the roots of antagonism within feminism, completely departing from the question of generations, which I don't think, or at least when it concerns birth dates, I don't think it's a valid analytical kind of line. So I think that to not undertake this revisionism would condemn us, for example, to an inability to connect Saquet's convincing assertion about the rootedness of a certain kind of artwork, in that case, that's what she speaks about in her book, in the radical demands of social movements in the 60s and 70s, and her equally convincing withdrawal from a progressive art platform that pretty much deals, you know, and explicates, let's say, the same works. So how can we connect these 2 things? In other words, feminist art theory must now attend to the gap between the artwork as the condensed point of political inquiry and the illusion of exceptionalism enveloping art in conditions of capital accumulation. We really need gendered readings of the production of value, I would say, which is a huge discussion, but not in feminism, in other quarters of art theory. So, the production of value implicating gendered individual producers and their labor outputs, that is artworks, which become apparently mass gendered as women's work in the art market. Whatever an artwork does and whatever form it takes, it cannot be the principal site of feminist interventions, in my view, but merely one such site. If artists and art theorists wish their intervention to not just cross from the art world to the real world, but to also dismantle this politically debilitating binary. What I'm saying is not new, but merely, I think, renews the pledge evident already in feminist theory and politics in the 70s, to remove art history's focus from artworks in order to instead prioritize, in that case, an inquiry into who has the right to be recognized, right, as the maker of artworks. And yet today, we have Marxist, feminist, and to my great surprise recently, anarcha-feminist approaches to art that single out artworks as the privileged focus of critical analysis. And this is something that I'm actually questioning. The exceptionalism of art is also asserted and defended in Marxist analysis, as I said, such as in this great book, Art and Value, by David Beach, which is dubbed the first comprehensive analysis of art's political economy throughout classical, neoclassical, and Marxist economics. And I think what allows this assertion of exceptionalism, what permits it, is the focus on artworks in the book, such as those produced by Damien Hirst, rather than what we might call the relations of production. I'm using a complex Marxist term here, but we can talk about it. The relations of production implicating class, gendered, and racialized subjects, by which I mean that the locus of value, right, cannot be disentangled from the multitude of relations that organized hierarchically prior to, before this locus of value has existed and which actually permitted to exist. About a decade ago already, for me it's very fresh, but anyway, it's already 10 years, Thierry de Duve, alarmed by the endless list of biennials, also argued about art's exceptionalism, a different discourse this time. He says, we ought to rescue art from its identification with cultural goods in global circulation under capital's command. And this time, he proposed through Kant and aesthetics to see art, by which he also meant just artworks. So we have this constant return, as having value other than, he says, its economic or entertainment value. And as a feminist art theorist, I ought not, is my response to this. I think that if feminists in the 70s had done that, we'd never have an understanding of how gendered images are not just produced, but also consumed across art, film, advertising, porn sites, churches, and even as embodied and compulsively performed identities, to go back to Butler. But art is not composed merely of images, or objects for that matter, or performative events, or social projects, of which I'm sure you've heard a lot, right, about socially engaged art. And we know that art far from has the monopoly on aesthetics, the latter being a dimension of relating to the world shared with much more vulgar commodity production regimes such as Apple Watches and so on. I think this is analyzed so much in postmodern theory that we hardly need to go back to it. As a feminist art theorist, a perplexing problem, not the only one, right, that I have in my hands is how to provide a theoretical framework that explains the non-exceptionalism of art as far as the gender hierarchy is concerned, including in, or even specifically with regard to the economy. To say that we need a gendered analysis of Greg Cholet's, who actually drew on Carol Duncan to put forward a certain term. Yes, we need, where he identified art's dark matter, right? All the kind of invisible matter that permits the art pyramid to exist. To say that we need to gender this dark matter is just the beginning, given that if in the 70s feminist art history pointed to the exclusion of women from art education in the 19th century, for instance, today art schools and art history classes are packed, they're completely full with, well, female students. And yet the art pyramid, topped by white males, remains unaltered. What do we answer to those who say that if women want better and better paid jobs, they should stop enrolling on gender studies and art programs, right, and opt for STEM degrees? Like, what is the answer to this? What is the generality in which this particular advice, which we've heard in the media a lot, seems logical to some, themselves constituted as subjects within the generality? As David Harvey has pointed out, Karl Marx opted to establish the parameters of the generality within which particularities are articulated. And he says, David Harvey says, we may infer that Marx views history on the one hand and economics and the critique of political economy on the other as two distinguishable, if not separate, fields of inquiry. And this posed limits to Marx's own analysis, according to Harvey. Why? Because Harvey is a geographer who necessarily has had and still has to explain specificities and particularities, much like feminist and certainly Marxist feminist art theorists need to do. Yet art, the art field, is already a particularity within a generality, capitalism, where forces and relations of production develop, giving us capitalism as not just the economy, of course. Let us briefly look at the particularity art, as described in Cholette and Oliver Ressler's opening essay to their 2013 book, It's the Political Economy Stupid, The Global Financial Crisis in Art and Theory. And there they say, sorry, before we see that, first of all, they say that according to investment firms like Artist Pension Trust or Cultural Indices, an artist's market value is measured by his or her presence in A-rated galleries, museum collections, auction sales, reviews, grants, and so forth. Even art world buzz matters, they say. And we note here first the replacement of an artwork's market value with an artist's market value, right? And secondly, we notice that that said market value apparently can be his or hers. And now, after we've done this, we read, one important difference from the last major financial crisis is that in the 20s and 30s, artists and intellectuals often chose to identify with a well-organized anti-capitalist left. In the years since then, not only has the left become disorganized and the definition of their working class becomes less precise, but within the realm of culture, divisions of labor, including those between curator, artist, and collector, have broken down and blurred. Not without irony, this ambiguity is the outcome of the world's version of deregulation, right, neoliberalism, on several levels. Here, feminist art theory must intervene. And first of all, the artist's market value is far more his than hers. And even Tracy Emin had to make this point in her 2006 documentary. I don't know if you're aware of that, What Price Art, where she asked actually why she herself and others kind of like fetch very low prices in comparison to other contemporary art prices on the market. So this is the particularity of gender within the particularity of art, within the generality of capitalism. In this generality, in 2014, Emin's My Bed, in which she's sitting there, sold by Saatchi at Christie's for 2.2 million. He had bought it in 2000 for 150,000 pounds. Second, and I'm referring back to what Cholette and Ressler say here, right? All these divisions of labor they mention and more are traversed by the gender division of labor, structuring not just art, but significantly the relationship between the art world and the real world. This mess, Hito Steyer argued in 2010, is kept afloat by the sheer dynamism of loads and loads of hard-working women, because it is women that we have in this room and in the art world at large. If you want, you can look around you. So, this is why, in a recent essay, Kirsten Lloyd and I insisted on revisiting the history of art in terms of a history of labor through the prism of social reproduction theory. A feminist critique of the political economy of art must inevitably begin with social reproduction theory, not least for addressing the thorny issue of where capital's process of value production starts. And this feminist artists share with everybody else, and women artists. While this divides, this issue that divides even Marxist feminists, we know that capital sees as indispensable the vast range of feminized and productive, as it's called, labor. And crucially, these terrains seem to encompass both work and the gray area of participation, also, it's not quite work, it's something that counts, however, that is important for the economy, right? Work and participation in the art field, not contributing directly to the valorization of capital, and what is still called women's work. So we really need to attend to this distinction. This is, however, just one route to follow, if the aim is to grasp the historical specificity of our feminized art field, where nonetheless women continue to underperform, as we would say. We can call this the internal inquiry of social reproduction in art. Another route to follow would involve a critical examination of the clash between the art field in its institutional determination and social constituencies that, despite being external to art, are subject to feeling the impact, right, of the art field's material articulation in shared social space. The case of Boyle Heights, that I mentioned before, is far from unique. Yet, this kind of conflict can assume truly enormous proportions when, for example, a national body, including, of course, women, right? Women identified very much with their national context. And so a national body identifies an art institution of international influence with capital's neocolonial practices. If we take Documenta 14 as an example of an art institution finding itself in the middle of such a conflict, and perhaps you know how this controversy is at the moment being shaped in Germany, no amount of feminism included in its public program and exhibitions would have been sufficient to displace the grievances generated by capital's operation. And of course, it didn't. As I have argued elsewhere, this is not a question of who is right and wrong, the progressive art institution or the social constituencies refusing to even consider art's aesthetic breakthroughs and the opportunities it offers for emancipatory politics. So I don't think we can speak in these terms even to pose this question. In this respect, feminism needs to move beyond institutional critique, and feminist art theory must address the co-implication of biopolitics and geopolitics in diminishing the political efficacy and relevance of artworks, basically rendering artworks almost irrelevant in such conditions of conflict. We can call this the external inquiry of social reproduction in art. I chose, therefore, this short exposition of, on the need for a feminist critique of the political economy of art. I'd like to close it, yes, with the words of Rosemary Hennessy, written from the position of a lesbian mother, academic working on materialist feminism. And she says, in the study of culture, this recognition of losses and retraction of workers' rights has recently manifested in signs of an increasing interest in moving beyond study of the material of culture alone in order to reconnect cultural forms to the material realities of capitalism. The work of this reconnecting turns on debates over how to understand the link between culture and political economy, that is, debates over the material relationship between the discourses by which we make the world intelligible and the structures of accumulation and labor on which capitalism irrevocably depends. And you know, she wrote this, as you can see there, in 2000. I mean, that's like a long time ago. Yeah? So that's actually 17 years before the International Women's Strike would call for a feminism of the 99%. Feminist art theory now must clearly move beyond mere signs of an increasing interest in exposing this material relationship, if indeed it sees value in art other than profit and pleasure, which is the title of Hennessy's book, from this quote, right? But somehow relevant to deduce more recent argument, because he also wanted to rescue art from profit and pleasure. So, if not, I fear that feminism in the art field will be stuck in the contradictions of reforms, having lost sight of its revolutionary horizon, that should be dictating what reforms help us reach it, that horizon, and if they do so at all. Thank you.
I'm going to open up to questions from you, of course, but first I want to start asking a few questions. And it's funny because we had already a rehearsal of this panel discussion like a couple of hours ago, so now we just have to repeat. And a lot came across when we were just talking in between the three of us. So I have, you both have talked about this already, but I have, again, a general question. And maybe you can flag up more specifically what I want to ask. So how would you think about feminism and art theory and feminism and art history? And I'm sure that you want to also specify a distinction between the two in terms of their political value now. And do you think that feminist art theories is just a specialism or is relevant to present social conditions?
I think I answered that.
Yeah, you answered that. Maybe Griselda a bit more.
Inherent in your question are two or three assumptions which I would like to just open up a little bit, which is, and I found your paper very compelling, Angela, so there's a sense in which you are giving meaning as you speak all the time to the sense of what it would be to be talking about feminism in terms of exactly a project that is still finding itself, developing itself, meeting certain kinds of internal paradoxes, and certainly negotiating the kind of complexity of the world that changes under our very feet. So what we need to avoid, which is the bad habits of academics and others trying to sort of take hold of things and make them into categories, is to use the term feminist as if we know in advance what that means, so that feminist art or feminist art theory constitutes an adjective whose meaning everybody agrees what it is. So my point would be this question of the virtuality of feminism, that we do not yet know the implications of it, and that the different kinds of conditions we face demand, as Angela's laying out, responses to new challenges. If we just use the term feminist art or feminist art history, we make feminism just a local or particular qualifier of something that we've already left intact, art or art history. All my work has been, in a sense, critically involved with the deconstruction of the political, ideological effects of what we call art history, the discipline, which is, a discourse, a formation of knowledge. It has a particular iterative ideological effect, which is keeping in place, in one sense, the exceptionalism, but particularly, as I was arguing, a concept of the artist. So I don't think it's a question of saying, does it still have any relevance, right? I'm wanting to stress, we have worked for I've worked the last 40 years, others at different points have entered this debate, because it is of such a complexity within its own historic emergence as an intellectual, theoretical, political project. But because that happens in history, so as I was saying to you before, the conditions of my politicization in 1968 did not anticipate that the world would be as it became after 1989. We did not encounter the questions of the technologies. We did not encounter the questions of the mass, as it were, transformations of the planet. We did not encounter the sense of the kinds of immiseration, what Zygmunt Bauman calls the perpetual production of wasted lives under the effects of global capitalism. So we are always responding to, as indeed it seems to me engaged artists are responding to, not yet known dimensions of the social and political world that we are struggling with. So my answer, of course, is yes. Obviously, as Angela is saying, is we have a job to do, but I cannot understand anybody who begins to say that maybe it's not relevant anymore, given the intensity of on the one hand, the violence against women at all levels, and whether it's in representation to the physical and material, and given the dimensions that you are laying out in terms of this notion of capitalism has, in this particular stage, in some sense, feminizing in that sense of what historically capital used women's labor to do, everybody. So, of course it does.
Can I just... yeah, I think we can take it earlier. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, I think you've written in the Feminist Art Histories and Marxism article that the bourgeois revolution effectively was a historic defeat for women. And we can start with that. We can start with the very early divisions and how actually women and feminism shaped on the grounds of a defeat. Because there was another battle before, or at the time, you know, we're not going to go into that, but I think it's certainly a transgenerational, you know, question. I also think that history at present is not going to ask us if we want to take part as, you know, feminist art theories. We have the emergence of, I would say, feminism in terms of a movement, because feminism has not always been a social movement. In some cases, it has been kind of like a cluster of ideas, if you will, transmitted differently to the work that a social movement was doing in the 60s and 70s, for instance. But right now, we have, through the formation that we call the Women's Strike, the international project, and more local projects, certainly, and through feminist activism, the return of this thing called feminism as a social movement. And there, you know, either we're going to develop the concepts, as Griselda was saying, to address, aid, enhance this, or we're going to be ignored and pushed back into our disciplinary boundaries when we can carry on discussing various things. And it is a critical moment, I would say. And I'm also in favor of not speaking about feminist art history or feminist art theory, but about, maybe, I don't want to use feminism and, but I think feminism is a politics, right? And then you have various sides of its realization. So we need to be, yeah, very, very careful about the terms and the concepts we draw and we use in our struggles.
Can I just add one element also to that, just as a point that appears, which is, again, what I was trying to say. If we talk about feminist art history or feminist art theory as a way of sectionalizing, thinking about these questions, or thinking historically, or thinking politically, or thinking theoretically, the question is, once this has been historically posed, it cannot be ignored, right? And yet, what we inherit now is a discourse which, in its attempt to ignore it, is going to cast it in the dustbin of history or exactly sectionalize it. But it's very clear that there is no security. So just to go to the anecdotal level of just two things. Obviously, Linda Nochlin died very recently. There is no preparation in her institution to continue her work. They will reappoint at the Institute of Arts in New York a 19th century French specialist. They will not say what we need is a feminist thinker.
Seriously, this is outrageous.
This is what will happen. I am now beginning to not teach anymore at my university, where I have created what my graduate students and I call a feminist space at Leeds for 40 years, with a whole raft of women who made it by virtue of coming there. There is no planning that this would be necessarily a field to carry on. They will say, when they can get the money back from when I retire, they will say, oh, we need somebody to teach the 19th century or contemporary art. They're still thinking in those terms, and the water will close over where I've been. It is carried, of course, in the minds and hearts and creativity and political work of all the women who made it a feminist space by passing through it, so it's disseminated, as indeed your students will be disseminated. But it is not secure that in 10 years' time this will be recognized in any way as an academic revolution that it was. Right? So this is, you know, so it's not just should it be gone, but it is really serious that the locations of this, and they're so scattered, and we form these very tenuous networks, but insofar as it's just, oh, well, in my university, Griselda does the feminism, so nobody else is taking it on board as a central problem. Whereas I do, Marxism, I do post-colonial, I have to take on everything, because once it's in front of you, posed as a major issue, you take it on. And somebody said to me the other day, in terms of a politics of citation, a conference about sociology, if you look at what whom feminist writers cite when they're doing their research and theory, everybody. if you look at what the major writers who are mainstream, and they'll count as men for this moment, whether they are straight or queer, they do not cite us. We are not integrated into the sort of acknowledged, necessary, cannot do without knowledge bases, right? So we're allowed to come and talk as feminists, rather than, in a sense, to talk feminism to a situation in which everybody recognizes this is the major issue. And as we're here assembled, I say to people, you know, I did a talk the other day in London, and the dealer who was hosting this space for a variety of curious reasons, it was about feminism, looked around the room and said, why are there only women here? And I said, I very rarely ever get to talk to men.
That's true. That's
brilliant to be here, but that's one of our problems.
But that's also our problems, as Andrea was saying, at the university. Like art history students are 90% women, and then art history professors are 90% men. Let's be honest.
The institutions are set up to ensure that there are enough people to pay the fees or fill the rooms or make the universities think the subject's big enough. And even when I was a student, I knew that the Courtauld, where I studied, was filled with women, so that Nick Sirota, Neil McGregor, you know, I could name the four men, and they became the director of the British Museum, the director of the Tate, you know, they were being prepared, and we are, in our historical terms, the staffage. We are the population that surrounds to make it look respectable. And yet some of us stood up and said, I'm progressive.
Because there's a bit of feminism there.
Well, okay, now that there's a bit of...
No, I'm a bit shocked that you said that that the Center of Studies, the course you're teaching, that you have established, are gonna die. I mean, and we were talking about that before, like your major text. You're calling them your baby text in the early 80s, and you didn't really want to talk about it, but maybe you can now say how you have changed from that point to now, as an art historian, how your understanding of these concepts have changed through the years, probably, and that could be how you have changed through as your role as an educator and confronting like the world and your students in thinking about like feminism and history during like all these years.
Can I just?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to say that it's not just Professor Pollock's responsibility to maintain that center, or
Of course not.
you know, I think it's a collective responsibility, and how we're positioned in the British academia, where we both are, is a very neoliberalized, you know, context. Maybe in Germany is different. I doubt it, but I'm sure there are differences, I don't know, important ones. Anyway, so we are in that other space nonetheless, where everybody buys real estate, okay? So that's what vice chancellors do, and student fees to buy real estate, anything that gets squashed, and you know, it's fine, it can die. But it is not, I mean, what feminism has brought to the discipline of art history, to the humanities, to the connection between real space, you know, what you might want to call life, and criticality, you know, in the university of how we understand things, is our collective responsibility. So if we don't take action collectively against this, I don't think it's an individual project. Sorry.
No, but I was not implying this. I was trying to move from that and trying to
protest. It's not.
No, but of course, like people should protest. But also, this is something that it regulates from who has money. So, who has money at the University of Leeds that established the courses, and what is the student demands? So, the student demands also has an influence on the courses that we have at university. Unfortunately, I'm sure your course is very popular. That's why I'm surprised that they want to just like close it down.
Yeah, but so I want to go back 2 steps. It is important to recognize that the success of the women's movement as a social force in the 20th century is why I sit in rooms with lots and lots of women. Okay, because it means that every single one of them imagines that they had the right to go to university, they would go to university, and they're asking themselves, who am I going to be? That is a huge transformation. Now, the fact that the world is going to give them very little to be in terms of its economies is another complicated question, but we cannot underestimate the value of that. Secondly, why the classes they're not popular, they are urgent, they are needed, right? Women turn up because suddenly someone is daring to speak in public. That's what I meant about, the Hannah Arendt, about the sense of the political becomes the space of speech and action where things get said because we say them to each other. There becomes the space of appearance, Hannah Arendt talks about, where we appear to others in our singularity and in our plurality as a complex, not a complex unity, but a complex collectivity. So the space of the classroom, the space of where feminism has come into, and I teach art students, art historians and cultural studies students, there is a hunger and a need to find a way to translate the unspoken nature of their encounters. How many of them come to university, let's be brutal, having been brutalized, having been raped, having to negotiate issues around sort of all the range of sexual harassment, all the range of sexual or gender procedures. I used to teach fine art students who all would turn up as punks, and I thought, this is fabulous, because the quality of your looks was based on your creativity. Whereas now I look out on groups of students, all of whom look identical. Their hair is highlighted. It used to be called what I call the pink pashmina look. Okay, there's a certain class that comes to art history as well. But there's a kind of curiosity between women taking courses where they study about riotous bodies, revolutionary bodies, queer bodies, dissonant bodies, and all the rest of it, and all speaking this, looking perfectly groomed as if they're made up for a selfie. These contradictions are being really lived in so many ways, and we mistake that when we think, oh, well, art history has become feminized. It's there because many cases art history is being taught in places like Edinburgh or London or Brighton or Leeds in ways that speak to experiences and present ways of women to think themselves in a past by presenting a past that is full of diverse creativity. So I think we could have a debate about this question of the art and the artist a bit further. But I don't want us to leave here thinking that somehow this is a sad state of affairs. It's a proof that women now have the aspiration, but they also have the demand to have what I consider the feminist revolution, which is for women to speak critically, intellectually, theoretically, in their own name to this urgency that feminism put on the table amongst the other things that have been put on the table, i.e. to make gender a category of historical and political thought.
I actually think, and on this note, we can close here. I think it was a great discussion, beautiful last intervention as well. So please join me in thank Angela and Griselda Pollock again